Hey everybody, it's Bennett Glace. I'm here today with Chicago-based filmmaker, critic, and teacher Michael Glover-Smith for a special episode of Split Picks. Craig Wright, our founder and usual host of Split Picks, couldn't be here today, so I'm filling in. I've got my feet on his desk, I'm farting in his chair, and I'm ready to rip and roar. Michael, when we last spoke in April of 2020, it was to discuss your second feature, Mercury in Retrograde, which was playing virtually thanks to the Gene Siskel Film Center. What have you been up to in the last year and a half?
Well, I've since shot another feature film, which I hope you'll want to interview me about when that is released early next year. So it's called Relative, and it stars the great Wendy Roby, who your listeners probably know from Twin Peaks and Twin Peaks: The Return.
And The People Under the Stairs as well.
And The People Under the Stairs, which is a great elevated horror film before the phrase existed.
So we're here today to discuss one of my favorite filmmakers and yours, Clint Eastwood. And this may be a tough question to answer since he's so ubiquitous and has been since long before either of us was born. But how did your relationship with Clint Eastwood start?
That's kind of a tough question for me to answer because I can't remember a time when I was not a Clint Eastwood fan. You know, I literally saw Any Which Way You Can on HBO when I was 6 years old. And I don't know if you've seen that film or not. That's the sequel to Every Which Way But Loose. And those are the two PG-rated action comedies where he stars opposite an orangutan named Clyde. And I haven't seen those films as an adult or even as a post-adolescent, but I loved those films as a kid. I mean, they were kind of the ultimate introduction to Clint Eastwood for a 6-year-old boy because, you know, it's about a bare knuckles fighter who hangs out with a primate. A couple years after that, in 1983, I saw my first film starring Clint Eastwood on the big screen, which was a film called City Heat, where Clint starred opposite Burt Reynolds. Again, a movie I've not seen as an adult, and I understand it's very bad. But as a child, I loved it. And a lot of the kids did, you know, at my school. It was kind of a popular film because we all loved Clint from the orangutan movies. And we also loved Burt Reynolds from
Smokey and the Bandit?
Not Smokey and the Bandit, Cannonball Run.
Oh, yeah.
Cannonball Run just, you know, played on HBO all the time. So I was a fan of Clint as an actor. And then as I got a little bit older, my father showed me The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. I was probably 10 when I saw that. My dad told me it was the greatest Western ever made. So I fell in love with that. And then somewhere along the way, you know, I became aware of the fact that he was also a director. You know, I was watching High Plains Drifter and Play Misty for Me and so on and so forth. I think the first film that Clint directed that I saw in the theater was Unforgiven in 1992, which I managed to see 3 times. And I've kind of been a hardcore fan ever since.
So my discovery of Clint, the movie star, and Clint, the director, and Clint, the icon, all happened kind of simultaneously, I think. Until pretty recently with the A Star is Born debacle, I was like an obsessive Oscar fan. I wouldn't just like watch it every year. I would like follow along and like make my own predictions and read all the blogs. The first year I ever watched it, going in basically cold, was in 2004 when Million Dollar Baby kind of came out of nowhere. I was 10. And won all the big awards. So yeah, I kind of became aware of his various hats at once. And even though I kept watching the Oscars, it was pretty quickly that I started to regard like the Oscars and the movies they were awarded as being like shitty. So I think like Clint's output after that would have struck me as kind of like white elephant art. And it wasn't until pretty recently, honestly, like last year, well, the 1-2 punch of like Sully and the Mule kind of got me like into like a growing appreciation of his kind of late style. I think those are literally the first two of his movies that I've seen in theaters. And
Wow.
then kind of yeah, last year, early pandemic, I rewatched or watched and rewatched everything he'd ever made, and was kind of completely blown away. So while I was still basically Clint agnostic in like 2014 and 2015, I remember reading White City Cinema for the first time, and I was surprised to see you go to bat for J. Edgar in particular and the Oscar era in general. Do you still consider the aughts to be his best decade as a director?
Oh, the aughts. I did say that in that review. I should have reread that. I don't know if I would or not. I probably not. I don't think I would segregate his career by decade in discussing it any longer because I feel like there's really not that much of a difference. I feel like he's always kind of doing the same thing, and yet he goes in and out of critical favor in a way that is not common. I think David Lynch is somebody who has had a similar career because I was a huge David Lynch fan also as a teen, and when Wild at Heart came out and then Fire Walk with Me, he really it was really just like tragically unhip to like David Lynch for a good 7 years during the 1990s, and it wasn't until Mulholland Drive came out that David Lynch became cool again. So I think Clint. I don't know. I mean, I like all of it. I like all of it. It's all good. Even the bad movies are good.
Yeah, that's how I feel about him. I think he's one of those directors for me, one of the very few where like every single film of his is interesting just by virtue of the fact that he made it. And the fact that he's kind of had like the same themes in now like 6 decades or 5 decades as a director is so impressive. Like I'm struck by how many like handoff films he's done where he's continued to outlast the person he was supposed to be kind of like handing the reins to. The two that come to mind are A Perfect World, one of his best films, and The Rookie, one of his, we'll say, weaker films. Both of
Right.
those are clearly supposed to be him kind of like, passing the mantle onto a young
Charlie Sheen,
star.
the new
And
Clint Eastwood.
both Charlie Sheen and Kevin Costner, they had their moments as movie stars, but like, you know, as the mule proved, Clint is a bigger box office draw than Kevin Costner in his 80s.
Yeah, and I just thought about something the other day. Clint's career as a director has now spanned exactly 50 years.
Yeah.
From Play Misty for Me in '71 all the way up till now. And all of my favorite directors are directors who have careers that span at least 50 years. There's just something very satisfying, I think, about being able to study the work of a filmmaker who has a consistent vision, a coherent vision. And of course, Clint's, his films have evolved in terms of theme and style, but there is a consistency there in the same way that there is with directors like Alfred Hitchcock, whose career spanned 50 years, John Ford and Luis Buñuel. They all had 50-year careers. The funny thing about Clint, though, is normally when a director's career spans half a century, it's because they start in their 20s and then they end their career, in their 70s. And Clint is the only one who started in his 40s and is still going in his 90s.
Yeah, it's so incredible that he's been like too old for this shit. And that's why like seeing people complain about how
Yeah.
old he is in Cry Macho, I'm like, have you seen any of the movies he's made since like the 80s? Because the bit has always been that he's too old to be in whatever position he's in, too old to be as attractive to women as he is.
Going back into the 70s. I mean, I just watched the Eiger Sanction for the first time, which that was the last film for me to see that he had directed that I had not yet seen. And he plays an art history professor who's also an assassin, which is hilarious. But he's a retired assassin who gets pulled back in for one last job. So that was 1975. That's really the first time he played a recently retired character, and he's been doing it ever since.
Right, yeah. Firefox immediately after that, he's pulled back in. But what's so funny about the Eiger Sanction is they make such a big deal about how old the French guy he's climbing with is. He's visibly younger than Clint. He looks a decade younger than Clint. That movie is incredible because he really did all those stunts. I like climbing. It's like Mission Impossible.
Oh yeah,
decades earlier.
The mountain climbing sequences are incredibly shot and just really fun to watch. So I was pleasantly surprised by it.
Yeah, there's another good example of even when his movies are kind of objectively not great, there's a lot to admire, and they're pretty interesting just by virtue of starring Clint Eastwood. So, like we kind of alluded to it in the discussion of J. Edgar, or in referencing J. Edgar. So, like I don't know, to me, like Clint is a victim of a lot of misconception. I think people often dismiss him out of hand, either as a conservative crank or as just sort of like a lazy, one shot and we go to lunch director. What would you say to people who can't see the artistry in Clint's directorial output?
That's a really good question. Well, he's always been kind of perceived as anti-intellectual, and I remember, Pauline Kael like famously said that Clint Eastwood was not an artist. Like she didn't even say he was a bad artist. She like wouldn't even grant him the status of an artist, and that's because, of course, he was a movie star first, who became a director, and I think it took some people a while to catch on that the films he was making were highly personal, because in the 80s he would kind of alternate between doing genre fare, or he would do Dirty Harry movies, and then he would turn around and do smaller scale films like Bronco Billy and Honky Tonk Man. And then I think when Bird came out, that was sort of like his art film, that really made people take notice of him as a director, because he didn't appear in it, and it's about jazz. It takes place in a predominantly African American milieu, so that was thought of as a departure for him. But of course, if you've been paying attention at all, I mean, his love of jazz runs through his whole career, including Play Misty for Me and The Gauntlet. So I think that, and Bird also famously premiered at the Cannes Film Festival, so I think that gained him a certain respectability. When Unforgiven came out, I think people really felt like he was close to retiring. Uh, so I think the Oscars for that were almost like a lifetime achievement award. Like, okay, he's 62, he's old, he's playing an old cowboy, and then 30 years later he's still going. So I think the misconceptions about him have kind of changed over time. I think more recently, people watch his films through this lens of he's the guy who spoke at the Republican National Convention in 2012. So we have to talk about The Chair, because I feel like, the past decade, his reviews have been the most lukewarm, and I think that has everything to do with the speech he gave in 2012.
Yeah, despite the fact that I honestly think these are his best films. I mean, I think like the best of his films for me are probably like Bridges and Unforgiven, like everybody would say. But I think like for
Yeah.
me, the most interesting run of his career is like Sully, the Mule, the 1517 to Paris. These like odd movies. And to your point about the seed of his love of jazz always being there, people complain about the sort of detours and diversions in movies like Richard Jewell and the Mule. Him eating the ice cream sandwich, or like them playing the entirety of the Macarena. Play Misty for Me features a scene that goes on for like 5 minutes where they're just watching performances at the Newport Jazz Festival. Like he's always been this director. He's always been this sort of discursive director who follows the weird little highways and byways.
Which arguably reaches its apex in Cry Macho. I mean, I know we're going to talk about that in a minute, but the relaxed quality of that film, I think Clint is at his best when his films have a very relaxed pace, and when he digresses from plot. He is not a plot driven director. He's a hangout director.
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, that's why what's so great about Bridges is it feels like you get to watch like the entirety of like the 3 days they spend together, like in a good way. Like it just sort of, I feel like he's at his least interesting when he's doing these sort of plotty, kind of intrigue heavy movies. Like I love Absolute Power for like the Clinton body count of it all. It's sort of like sleazy, but like I don't know, like you can't compare that to a movie where he's just sort of like letting the gang hang out. Like Bronco Billy, like when he makes movies that are rich in like camaraderie and diversions. That kind of leads into my next question. I was going to ask, what are like the modes you especially like to see Clint in, or what are the themes you especially like to see him wrestling with?
Well, I think I've really come to value his depictions of community, and Bronco Billy is the best example of that. So many of his films are about people who construct alternative families, and it's all about how the family that you choose, the people that you choose to be around, is that's more important than the family that you're born into. So his films are always about people making connections with other people, forging connections. Oftentimes after having become estranged from their birth families. That's something you see in A Million Dollar Baby, of course, where the Clint's character is estranged from his daughter for reasons that are never explained, but you get the impression that he did something terrible in his past. And so, him playing all these old characters for the past 35 years, he's always somebody who's haunted by his past. He has demons, and yet is still able to learn and to make connections with younger people and learn from his mistakes. And I think there's something really beautiful about that.
Yeah, I especially like the films where he casts like real members of his family, including the very hilarious appearance of Scott Eastwood in Gran Torino.
Yeah,
As a guy in a tall tee. But like Honky Tonk Man and the Mule, especially, have him like casting real members of his family and sort of wrestling with that. I also especially like him in like Honky Tonk Man and Bridges Mode, when he's like an artist like straining to be taken seriously, because like you can tell there's like a bitterness and like a chip on his shoulder, despite the fact that he's been like the biggest of celebrities for like 70 years. Like when he won the Oscar for Unforgiven, he said something along the lines of like, I want to dedicate this to the French critics who liked me before it was fashionable.
Right.
Like he definitely like, I don't know, as much as he's been on top of the world, he definitely feels like, there's more he could get. And I don't know, I guess like if I like the films less, I might see that as like an entitled quality, but like, I don't know, he's Clint. He does deserve all the awards.
Right, but he does have some conservative political beliefs, and I think that's what prevents people from taking him seriously as an artist. In France, of course, they don't care, but here in America, I remember after he gave that speech at the RNC, and I remember Rachel Maddow saying something like, "Well, he's 82 years old, so I don't know if that's what's going on there." Implying he's senile, which I thought was really ageist and really disturbing. But a lot of people sort of interpreted that moment as a senior moment, like, "Oh, he's talking to an empty chair. He's crazy," when in reality he was just doing an old vaudeville routine, that a million people have done before.
And it kind of killed in the room too. Not that like killing at the RNC is like a mark of quality, but as awkward as it played on TV, it sounded like a kill.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I don't think it worked, but I don't hold it against him. He's a major artist. He's one of the great American artists of the past century, in my opinion.
So on your blog, you've gone to bat for J. Edgar and American Sniper, two films of his that kind of met interesting critical receptions. Are there any other films of his that you think people got wrong?
Yes. You know which one I love more than anybody is Midnight in the Garden of Good and Evil.
That's one I need to revisit, because that kind of did nothing for me. But it's a weird hangout, overlong, lot going on movie. Maybe I'd like it on a rewatch.
Yeah, I'd say watch it again and think about Kevin Spacey and his real life persona and the way that interfaces with the character he plays. Is really interesting.
I mean, the role he was born to play, you might say.
In a way, yeah. I was thinking somebody should make a Rock Hudson's Home Movies style essay film about Kevin Spacey, only using clips from his films. And you could do that and draw quite heavily on Midnight in the Garden of Good and Evil.
And then are there any Clint movies that you won't go to bat for? I mean, you sort of said you think they're all interesting.
Well, honestly, I actively dislike The Rookie, of course. And I also actively dislike Jersey Boys, believe it or not. It's okay. I think it's the least personal film he's maybe ever made. I think he had been trying to do A Star Is Born, and I think there was kind of an unusually long gap before he made that one, and I think he was kind of just looking to do something when he made it.
Yeah, I mean, for me, I think the scene where the one character like loses his virginity, it's usually set to "Oh, What a Night" in the actual musical, but when he loses his virginity and Clint is on the TV, like that buys it like 2 extra stars. That elevates a 2-star movie to a 4-star movie.
That moment was awesome. And I would watch it again. I only saw it once in the theater when it first came out, but I'll see it again if you see Midnight in the Garden of Good and Evil.
And I feel like before we transition into Cry Macho, I would be remiss not to ask your thoughts on the 1517 to Paris, probably the most maligned of his films.
Yeah, I think that's the one that has the lowest critical opinion. I actually disliked it when I watched it, and I haven't revisited it. But just thinking about it, my appreciation for it has grown. There are things about it that definitely I think don't work. I don't like the early scenes where the main characters are children. The
Uh,
scenes with their mothers, played by Judy Greer and the woman from The Office.
yeah,
Um,
Jenna Fisher. Yeah,
I don't think those scenes work at all. But there's something really bold about all the scenes of those dudes just traveling around Europe, going to clubs. The selfie stick.
uh,
Um,
the
it's
gelato.
Yeah, I mean, it's again that's like completely non-narrative in a way that's really interesting, because there's just no story there other than the incident of trying to prevent this terror attack, and the theme of destiny. you know so it's almost an experimental film in a way.
Yeah, no, it's that's what I like about it. I mean, it's again, it's yeah, you have to sit through that first like half hour, which is I don't know, it plays like like a God's Not Dead type movie or something. It's very
Yeah.
like awkward, and of course, the immortal line, "My God is bigger than his statistics." But I don't know, how could you, how could anyone think that Clint is like a lazy, uninteresting director when at like 88 he's doing this like experimental film? So we're going to take a quick break, and then we will transition into a discussion of Clint's latest film, his 39th directorial effort, Cry Macho.
Beginning Monday, October 4th, Split Tooth Media once again presents
October Horror.
Each Friday, Split Picks will be plunging into the depths of 4 iconic American directors' films and careers. With special guests and longtime Split Toothers, we will compare 2 films straight from the mouths of madness of John Carpenter, Wes Craven, George Romero, and of course, Tobe Hooper. We're looking at the should-be classics.
It's where you throw your cup of soda at the screen, but like enjoy.
Films that confounded critics. The New York Times called it hysterical vampire porn.
Right, you're perfectly describing why I like this movie. Don't threaten me with a good time.
And a few films that even the directors wish they could have remade. Join us all month at Split Tooth Media to celebrate October Horror once again.
The best to ever do it, at least horror-wise.
So Clint's career has offered a lot of litmus tests. You actually, I think, used the phrase in discussing American Sniper. I think you're referring to his like late style.
Yeah.
Well,
And the auteur theory. I mean, every director, when they get old enough, it's like the casual fans fall away, and it's only the diehards who are going to bat for the late style.
Are you of the mind that if you're not a fan of the late style, you're not a fan of the director? Because I kind of am.
I kind of am too. I mean, I teach film history, so I'm an auteurist. I teach the auteur theory, and I feel like the best directors kind of do their best work late in life, because that's when everything sort of gets boiled down to its essence, which is something I think you see in Cry Macho.
Yeah, and it's what they like want to leave behind. It's what they want to be remembered for. I think you see everything like start to come together. But yeah, his career has offered a lot of litmus tests for viewers and like the culture as a whole. The Dirty Harry movies, his kind of fraught relationship with Sandra Locke, American Sniper, Every Which Way But Loose. Moments where the question seems to be, are you in or are you out? And a lot of people decide that they're emphatically out. His late style has become kind of a multi-film litmus test. Could you describe Clint's late style and how it's evolved in the films leading up to Cry Macho?
Yeah, that's a really good question. First of all, I want to point out I'm a little bit hungover right now because I was at a wedding last night, and I imbibed a little too much. But this is relevant because at some point during the night, I slid into the DMs of a couple of film critics, and I told them that their inability to rally behind Cry Macho is the surest sign of the death of cinema yet. Because I was just thinking about Cry Macho and how much I loved it, and I started getting upset over the failure of the critical establishment to back this film, which it's everyone should be talking about it. So having said all that, I mean, I think Clint's late style, how would I describe it? I think visually, his films are just incredibly economical in terms of just looking like every moment was captured from one angle, and that's the only angle, and every shot had to be exactly where it is. And there's something really awe-inspiring about that. I mean, like when I watch his films, in Cry Macho, he uses a crane shot. He uses a lot of crane shots, but it's kind of like the crane is kind of subtly moving, and he just didn't get any coverage. He's doing one or two takes and then moving on. Also, of course, his films are incredibly dark, literally as well as thematically, and I mean, they look almost black and white at times. The interior scenes are just very, very, very dark, very little color, and I think they've grown darker over time in terms of what they say about America. I think he's become increasingly disillusioned with life in America. And that's one thing that I think connects him to John Ford, because Ford's movies, I think, were more optimistic about America early in his career. And then later on, he depicts places outside of America as paradise. Like if you watch The Quiet Man or Donovan's Reef, and then the films that take place in America just make it look like hell on earth, like Cheyenne Autumn or The Last Hurrah. It's like his vision of the settling of the West becomes more pessimistic. And I think you see something similar in Clint's work where, like Richard Jewell, that's just a dark, dark film. I mean, it's about this man's life is made hell by a combination of the government and the media. And then, if you look at Cry Macho, which could be his last film, it literally ends with him turning his back on America and, finding heaven on earth in a little Mexican restaurant in a small town in the middle of nowhere.
I think that's another thing that critics will never forgive him for is Richard Jewell's take on journalists. I think a lot of people took that really, really personally. And I think that's an incredible film. I think I'd probably maybe put it in his top 10, certainly his top 12.
Yeah, it's fantastic.
I think another popular complaint in the negative reviews, even some of the positive ones, is that Clint is too old for the material. I think you and I agree that complaining about Clint's age is missing the point. How do you think Clint's advanced age and kind of obvious physical frailty helped the film?
Well, I think it helps Cry Macho, and I think it helps The Mule, which are companion films. He looks physically frail in both of those films in a way that he did not in Gran Torino. In Gran Torino, he hands out a beatdown to a gangbanger, and it actually looks
pretty convincing.
It looks pretty convincing. And by the time you get to The Mule, I mean, he can't really, it looks like he can't really stand upright to his full height anymore. His posture is stooped. And so there's a great deal of poignance to just seeing him. And he's so thin, he looks like a bag of bones, There's just a poignance in seeing his body physically aged. But, one of the great things about Clint's entire career is the way he uses his persona as a director. Like the way I think his best films are the ones that he directs and stars in, because he knows how to use his persona better than anybody. And in Cry Macho, I've heard some people say, "Oh, he's too old." I mean, he'll never be too old as long as he can stand in front of the camera. He'll never be too old. He has a romance with someone who's several decades younger than him, but I believe she's actually older than his girlfriend is in real life. So in a way, she's age appropriate.
The movie has given a lot of fodder to the CinemaSins crowd. Everyone thinks they're so clever for pointing out why would Dwight Yoakam hire this 90-year-old man? And it's right there when he hires him, he says he'll know the second he sees you, you're a real cowboy. He's hiring him not because he's Mike Milo, a guy who owes him a favor. He's hiring him because he's Clint Eastwood.
He's Clint Eastwood.
And however old he is, he's Clint Eastwood.
Yep.
I nearly started crying when he said that.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, as a viewer, you bring your knowledge of all of his past roles to each new film, or at least you should, if you're
Yeah,
watching.
yeah.
If you're watching properly, I want to ask you how you felt about Dwight Yoakam's first scene, where he is just an exposition machine talking about before the booze, before the pills.
Yeah.
Um,
Um, it's not great.
yeah,
I don't know. The script could have used another pass, but if we're taking the film to be Clint Eastwood, Clint Eastwood basically playing Clint Eastwood, it's sort of fitting that like exposition would be doled out like that, because it's also doled out through like a series of headlines. Like it feels like,
yeah,
it's a movie that's very conscious of its like moviness, I think. Like
right.
he's introduced as a man on a mission, and it's only fitting that we would get this very like detailed, one would argue maybe overly detailed briefing before he goes off on the mission.
Right. Yeah, I actually, the second time around, I didn't mind it at all, and I actually kind of admired it. As well as the scene with Rafo's mother, as kind of the alcoholic, oversexed woman who first, offers him a drink, and then the next time she sees him, she literally invites him into her bed. A lot of people have a problem with that, but I feel like, the thing we were talking about earlier that we both admire about him is his, the relaxed, digressive nature of his approach to narrative. It makes it even more subversive in this film, because it's like he's getting that exposition out of the way as fast as possible. And the second time I saw it, I was like, oh, he just doesn't give a shit. He's just getting it out of the way as soon as possible. And I think most filmmakers try and dole that information out more gradually, and they try and do it in a sneaky way where you're not aware that they're giving you exposition. So there's something about the way that he just gets it over with. It's like, here's the character. This is what happened to him in the past. This is all you need to know. That makes the rest of it allows the film to really take off after that. Because the heart of the film is really that long second act where he's stuck in the town with Marta. And it's almost like that section becomes more sublime because of the way it's set up as a thriller in the first act. And then he kind of breaks the rules of, the kind of movie he's supposed to be making.
Yeah. No, I think having it doled out as so nakedly like an exposition dump does, it speaks to like an indifference on Clint's part to the narrative of it all. It's not important like why he's getting back on the horse. It's important that he's like getting back on the horse, So I actually wanted to return to the scene with Rafo's mother, which a lot of people seem to have a problem with. Age inappropriate love interests in Clint's movies is another common complaint. I guess I'm inclined to say that like it's the same as like, why would you hire a 9-year-old to do this job because it's Clint Eastwood? But I also don't know. I think my reading of the scene with Rafo's mother, I think that's just kind of like poorly written, quote unquote, crazy behavior from.
Yeah.
I don't know that she's necessarily like serious in propositioning Clint Eastwood.
Yeah, you may be right. And again, that was something that I think struck me as a little clunky the first time. But then the second time through, I really enjoyed it because I knew what was coming later. And I feel like the first time I watch any movie, I'm always just like everybody else, just trying to figure out what's going to happen. And a film like this, like I think a lot of Clint's best films, it's just about grace notes, and it's about just luxuriating in these graceful moments. And that scene with Rafo's mother, I think actually kind of sets up a dichotomy between her character and Marta, as being these sort of, two romantic possibilities for the character of Mike Milo. And, the fact that he has no time for Rafo's mother because he has a job to do. It kind of goes hand in hand. It's hand in hand with what I was saying about the exposition and the narrative, and feeling like you're going to watch a genre film because Clint's, he's got a job to do. He doesn't have time for this. But then, of course, as soon as he meets Marta, then he has nothing but time. And that actress is fantastic.
So good. Yeah.
I mean, the chemistry between her and Clint was amazing, just the way they look at each other. But to me, I cried the first time I watched it, but I cried a lot harder the second time Just watching them hold hands, sitting around the campfire, dancing, her teaching him how to make tortillas, and all the scenes where he interacted with the animals. It's just a really sublime, lengthy chunk of the film that is the absolute heart of the film, and that's where there's no suspense. It's like the question of, are the federales going to catch up to them, or it's just like the narrative stops cold and you're just hanging out with these people. And I also noticed something the second time that I think is very significant, which is that the name of the restaurant is Fondita de la Luna, the little kitchen of the moon. The moon is traditionally associated with female energy, and in cultures all over the world. And I think that's not a coincidence, because Marta runs the cafe and lives with her 4 granddaughters. Mm-hmm. So in a way, the film is about, I think, Mike Milo, this, hyper masculine rodeo riding guy who is also Clint Eastwood, movie star, sort of transitioning from this macho world to a more feminine world.
Yeah, the scenes with him and the kids are really wonderful, and I agree. The performance from the actress who plays Marta is really incredible. I wanted to kind of stay on the idea of the acting. Another common complaint, and this is one that's kind of dogged a few of Clint's film, is that his co-stars aren't really up to snuff, particularly the kid, Eduardo Minette, who's making his film debut. Do you agree? Do you think Clint's
totally
quick style does less experienced actors a disservice?
Totally disagree. I thought that kid was great, and I thought everybody was great in the movie, but I know where that's coming from. He's famous for his one-take style. People who don't like his films characterize them as slapdash. Like, oh, he's just he's not getting enough takes. If he would spend more time, then the performances would be more polished, which that's true to a certain extent, but I think his films also gain something from that 1 to 2 take style, which is a certain spontaneity that is absolutely thrilling to watch. And I mean, if a performance has awkward moments, that's not necessarily a bad thing. It makes the film feel more alive and more like a documentary a lot of the times. So that's one of the things I value the most in his films.
That was a big complaint about Gran Torino, is that the child and teen actors weren't up to snuff. And I think it's another example. I certainly felt that way in 2008, but now watching it again, I'm like, no, that awkwardness helps. How would you feel if this like snarling, mean old man like came into your house and was like bossing you around? You'd be like awkward about it. You wouldn't know what to say. You would
right. And you don't want kids who hitting all their lines perfectly and look like they were pushed into show business by their parents. I mean, the kids he casts, they look like real kids. They act like real kids. I thought Eduardo Minette was great.
And I think too, his like kind of like 1 or 2 take style can get unusually unmannered performances from big movie stars too. I really don't like Leo as an actor. I think he just does the same thing in every movie. He does that same like New York accent, and I think he's incredible in J. Edgar.
That is
probably because he wasn't getting enough time to burrow down into the usual like tics and bullshit he does.
Exactly. There's a story, I don't know how true it is, that DiCaprio wanted more takes, and that Clint said to his DP, okay, go ahead and shoot more, but make sure there's no film in the camera. Like, I'm out of here.
Yeah.
But, I think that's also true of Bradley Cooper in The Mule. I think that is his best performance. And I like Bradley Cooper. I like A Star is Born. I think that's a good old-fashioned melodrama. But Bradley Cooper's, he's trying pretty hard in the film. And it's effective. But what he does in The Mule is more effective because he's just saying his lines.
Yeah.
He's so unmannered, like you say, and so just everything he says is simple and direct. And it really reminds me of the way actors were in the golden age of Hollywood. Howard Hawks said that he had been trying for decades to simplify screen acting, and then Marlon Brando came along and shot everything he had been doing to hell through histrionics. I think Hawks was being a little perverse because Hawks was basically saying my style was more natural, and now that the method actors are here, they're over the top. But yeah, Bradley Cooper in The Mule really reminds me of like somebody like William Holden, who Clint worked with in Breezy, of course. Somebody who just doesn't have time to fuck around with acting because he's just too busy just saying the lines.
So on the subject of Clint himself as an actor, he's never been a big emotive actor. He's a presence guy.
Yeah.
He would rather kind of snarl a few lines than give a big monologue. I think my favorite example of that is, of course, in Unforgiven when he's got Little Bill on the ground. He says, "I'll see you in hell, William," and he just goes, "Yeah." But he gets kind of an Oscar scene in Cry Macho when he's explaining to Rafa what happened to his wife and son. Is this the most nakedly emotional we've seen a Clint character? Because even in $1 Million Baby, I think he's kind of guarded and more like tough love in how he addresses.
$1 Million Baby was his last Oscar nominated performance, and I think only the second one after Unforgiven. But I think he's better in Gran Torino. He actually has a very emotional scene in Gran Torino where he sort of tears up. But I think, Cry Macho, where you see that single tear roll down his cheek. The thing that so impressed me about that was really the framing of the shot and the fact that you don't see his eyes. I mean, any other filmmaker actor is going to really show off the fact that they're crying, but that's just not Clint's style.
An amazing choice. Any other actor turned director would be like, let me show you how great an actor I am without being a great director. And I know I'm so fascinated by actors turned directors because it's such an inherently hubristic thing. Like, let me show you that I know how it works on the other side of the camera. Like, I don't know, like I feel like it's a way for like actors to show that they're smarter than people might take them for. It's perceived as sort of intellectual. And I don't know, I like that like this late in his career, even though there have obviously been such huge like ego moments for Clint as both an actor and director. In Cry Macho, for his one big moment, he chooses something so simple, so understated. A lot of the film's power, and we've kind of alluded to this, comes from our existing relationship with Clint. Seeing him get back on the horse can't help but be moving if you're a longtime fan. Do you think the film will work or can work for someone who doesn't have a prior relationship with Clint as an icon?
That's a good question. I would be interested to hear someone's analysis of it who isn't familiar with his previous work. I think it would work, but I think there's probably an added layer of poignancy for those of us who have been watching him, for years and who have seen all of his films. The scene of just watching him on the horse, there are a lot of great shots of him in profile where you see him kind of silhouetted against the sunset. And his silhouette, his face, looks like it was, carved, like chiseled out of stone. And so it's hard not to see images of all of those previous characters, especially in Westerns like Will Money and so on and so forth, in a lot of those like sunset landscape shots.
I cried pretty early on just when it was like panning over the pictures of it, because just like seeing pictures of like actual like younger Clint Eastwood in this movie, it's like, yeah, I don't know, it feels like it really has all been building toward this. And then I don't know, when Dwight Yoakam says like he'll know you're a real cowboy, I was like,
yeah.
I mean, I don't know. It's unfortunate that it's not doing great business. It's playing to like more or less empty theaters. But I was glad no one could see me like crying about a pan over a couple of newspaper headlines.
How about the scene where he pets the horse's nose? I just lost my shit.
We did it, partner.
Yes, exactly. Or the line, I don't have a cure for old.
Oh my God.
Where he's talking about the dog, but he's also talking about himself. Incredible.
So as a final question, it's, I don't know, maybe a bit of a ghoulish, morbid question, but if Clint never directs another film, I mean, would you be happy to see him go out on Cry Macho? I think I would. Yeah,
I think it's actually. He probably is aware, and has been for a while, that each film could be the last. I think he will direct again, unless the box office is so bad that it'll be hard for him to get a budget. But I think he'll direct again because his mind is obviously still very sharp. But I honestly have a feeling this may be his last lead performance. And I think it's a very fitting performance for reasons that I've already stated, but especially just him turning his back on America and just driving back down to that little Mexican cafe. It's kind of like a vision of the afterlife, a vision of heaven. And that's where I want to see him be. That's a perfect place for him to end.
Yeah, I was so worried going in that it was going to end with him like biting it. It was going to end with him getting like shot by the federales or something. I'm glad that we get to see him go off dancing. As much as I love the ending of the Mule, the ending of the Mule makes me cry. I think this is like an even better place for him to end up.
I agree, and it's kind of the opposite in a way because he's in prison at the end of the Mule, even though he's doing something that
doing what he loves
in the prison. But, yeah, and the ending of the Mule, there's a song. This is really the last thing I would like to say, but there's a Toby Keith song at the end of that film. "Don't Let the Old Man In," which is apparently one of Clint's favorite phrases, because that's advice that he gives himself in order to not be old. Don't let the old man in is, stay young at heart. And I think the listeners of your podcast are probably fairly young. And I think that they should let the old man in, meaning they should let the films of Clint Eastwood into their hearts.
Beautiful. A beautiful sentiment to end on. Thank you so much again, Michael, for joining us. I hope you'll join us again to talk Clint soon, and I hope we'll be able to talk about your new feature when it has its premiere. Hopefully next year.
I would love that. Thank you for having me.
Yep, of course. And Split Tooth fans, be sure to check out our site this October for more October horror content. We've got some great podcasts and essays planned for you, so be sure to check out the site throughout the upcoming month. And thanks for listening.